Okay.
I don't know. They were, yeah. I'm not even sure. Okay, Turing's next door. Okay, this is the Rails. But Turing sounds cool. I want to see what's going on there. Chat, screen share. Here we go. Google Hangouts. Blah blah blah. Entire screen.
Yeah, very long time. Yeah, that's why. Why? I don't know. I do. Why? Yeah, they had like a very big governmental involvement. They're trying to push that
Hang on here, guys. We're not quite started yet. Might just crash. Yeah. Let's not do that. I remember when PowerPoint used to be slightly easy. Now it's all got all this like crazy from start.
Okay, all right. Yeah. But I graduated a long time ago. I got training and I it's a very tiny world that people.
Are you guys starting right now?
Just about to. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to leave this open for a minute. Try to air it out.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, just let it. Yeah.
Okay.
Starting in just a couple minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll like quasi-start actually, because we always give introductions and it sucks up like 20 minutes of time. So there's enough time at the beginning while we're eating or getting ready or whatever it is, just to sort of chat and everything. And since it's so small, we always do the same sort of social thing every time. So why don't we start? Over here? What's your name?
Anthony.
Hey, Anthony.
I've been using Rails for a little less than 2 years. Most of it's building applications for So,
Mhm.
and
Cool.
I'm Lawrence. I took a Rails course earlier this year. And eager Dave to keep exposed to Rails.
Sounds good. In the back.
I'm Ken, and I've taken some classes in school, Rails class in school, and I'm here to get to work. Take some classes at City College. So I think it's going to keep going.
Rails friends, right on. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dave. I was looking for the Hackathon.
Yeah, couldn't find it, so we were dropping in on Rails models.
I've only used Ruby with Sinatra.
Mm.
I have never.
Yeah, I like learning it that way.
I've always been curious, but never had time to actually use it. So this may be actually very good.
Okay, cool. And
I'm Shin. I'm going to the Japanese University student, so I'm still a student. And I work for a Japanese IT company. And a little bit like Ruby and Rails, but I don't know the details. So I'm really interested in Ruby and Rails, and I want to learn.
very good. Good. Okay. So, and my name is Dennis. This is only the second class I think that I've taught here actually. Although I go a long time, I've got gray hairs. I go a long time back. I actually originally came from more product side, and I consider myself more sort of in the entrepreneur sort of hustle and grit sort of space, startup space. And at one point I had run a systems integration firm, but we were doing like Java and enterprise Java and a lot of Microsoft at that time. The early part of that, we were doing PHP and SQL, and why that's important is that I'm still kind of old school that way, where I think of data being stored in databases in a more direct SQL sort of way. And one of the interesting things about Rails, of course, is that it tends to abstract out a lot of the SQL to the point where my cohort Brad, who teaches this stuff, says, I don't need to learn SQL. In some sense, I still feel that he knows more SQL than he's willing to let on. Okay, and I feel that and if you look at the Rails documentation, knowing SQL is how they explain their models. They say, starting from knowledge of SQL, blah, 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 and then they proceed with models at that point. So with that said, I'm not going to go deep into SQL in explaining what I'm going to explain today about models. This is part 2 of a course that started with Brad. He covered some basic Rails models usage. I'm going to recover that, do a little bit of that as well, but that's not going to be my main focus in doing this today. Okay. What I find when I'm teaching when I'm learning Rails, is that there were several big impediments to sort of getting it. Yeah, like you, I actually got past them by working with Sinatra. Okay. And which is a smaller framework and allows you to sort of like look at all of the model view and controller layer all together. But once you figured those portions out, then you can actually spend a little time figuring out things that are confusing at the beginning, like associations and so forth. And like I said, I'm actually, part of the reason why I'm teaching is that it was, I'm fairly new to this stuff. I am probably going to make a few mistakes in stuff that I will tell you. In teaching, it was a way of trying to give myself deadlines and give reinforcement to things that I had learned by re-presenting it to you guys. So if you catch me with an error, please explain it to both me and the rest of the class. Okay. So I've tried to, but at the same time, in reviewing the materials, I've sort of culled through the way that I have been able to learn it in practice, and I'm trying to present it to you in a way that maybe is a little bit more favorable than some of the online tutorials that I've seen that gloss over a few things. Just a little bit in depth. Okay, so let's see where we are in terms of just general Rails knowledge. I know that I have a general sense here, but everybody has just sort of a general sense of how Rails in general works, right? I'm assuming that most people have at least gone through some basic tutorials, that sort of thing, or done the Rails new blog and have seen like the basic framework fire up. Yes? No? Yeah, probably. Yeah, even if you have not, even if you haven't done like in-depth work on it, you've probably done that much. So I'm going to work from that basis, basically. And mind you, in what I'm going to cover today, I'm not going to go into views. I'm not going to go into controllers, although that's kind of part and parcel with the sort of thing that you need to do with models. But man, I was working through these slides basically, and I come up with like 25 slides. It's like, and getting through that in about 2 hours. And I'm not sure we're going to fill out the full 2 hours, but I could see us sort of spending that much time just sort of like figuring out the very simple thing that people get hung up on, which is the has many belongs to relationship, and then the confusingly named has and belongs to many relationships. Okay, so let me get to my slides here, and I think that'll start to help sort things out here. So, and if it's okay with you, I'm just going to display it like this because I don't like having that weird split screen thing because I'm going to be flipping back and forth between a few screens. So, can everybody read that okay, pretty much? Okay. Oh, and sorry, back Andrew. Andrew, hi Andrew. Nice to meet you. Dennis, and we're going to proceed with active record models, part 2. Okay, so one tip that I have as you walk through either this or in going through it yourself later, based on my, some of the influence that you'll get from this class, is to create a reference app or reference repo that basically goes through all of the associations that you learn. That's what I actually started doing in relearning Rails recently, is I knew that Rails models were going to be a big issue, but they all take basically the same form. So you kind of just need to know like what all the associations are, in my opinion, create sort of like a baseline reference of what all of these are, and then store them on GitHub or store them on Bitbucket, and then steal your own code over and over and over again. Okay, so in starting I may be able to provide some basis for you. I didn't quite finish all of my examples, but I'll try to provide that to you in a Git repo after the class. And like I said, I'm going to skip out on a lot of stuff. So this also includes skipping out on validations, which are important within models. That's not kind of what this is focused on. Again, this is focused on the associations. We're not focusing on scope, which is another way of being able to limit stuff within models and is important to know about. And again, we're going to skip out on controller and view usage, basically. So most of what we're going to be doing is setting up the associations for end-to-one and end-to-end, and then playing with them within Rails Council. And the idea being that if you configure that part out, you should be able to snippet out that code and then place it inside of your controllers and your views. Okay? Next slide. Okay, so there are many types of associations within models. And the idea of, maybe I should back up also just to sort of, I really didn't know exactly how to explain strongly enough, like to go into what sort of level of depth, basically, with respect to what is a single model, basically, that is not associated with something. Basically, a single model that is not associated with something. Gosh, you know what? I'm going to have to create something that is not on this. I don't want to do Evernote. Hang on. Oh, actually, let's actually use this thing. Okay. I'm going to kind of explain it old school style, where in a model, you basically have one. For a single model, you have like one concept basically that you usually are storing data in. And this should be familiar to you from tutorials. Things like a user or an article, for example. And the idea is that if you might think naively that you could create a single model that can contain both users and articles. But you could do that, but it does not give you a lot of the flexibility that is provided when you have modern databases and the modern way that people are able to create object relationships. Okay, so a characteristic of a model is that it basically pertains to a single concept. In Rails, the model usually is singular in name. This is really a big hang-up, actually. It's all the pluralization and what's plural and what's singular. It's singular and capitalized, but only in certain contexts. In other contexts, it's lowercase and plural. Okay, but when you're actually generating it, it's uppercase and singular. And usually, there's a single ID which is an integer value which is associated with it, so that you can track multiple things of that model type inside of a table. So for example, if you had a user table and you had 20 some odd users, their ID numbers are probably going to be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way through 20. That's pretty evident, right? What you probably also know is that you can do something like user 3 also has an additional property, which is his name or his address. Okay, so you can define tables and models in that sort of way. Okay, but if you wanted then to later associate an article with that user, let's say that you're creating a blog, our typical blog that everybody creates, then you might naively think, well, I'm going to throw the article inside the user table somehow. But that's not really what happens. What you do is you actually throw it into a different model, which is an article model. It has its own ID, and then it's going to have its own set of properties. So a lot of both database design, object design, application design in general is kind of figuring out the architecture, figuring out how things are going to break out. And it's something that you'll want to get used to in terms of something that you may create and then figure out, oh, you know what, I did it the wrong way, and having to readjust it again at some point. Okay, but I'm going to walk you through some of the standard cases that you sort of see, you know, at this point. When you usually learn. Like I said, so with this sort of definition of models in mind, let me run through a couple of association types that you commonly see. The most simple type is a one-to-one association, and it's so simple actually at this point that we're not going to cover it during this portion right here. This is the case where you might have a user and a user table with a name, and then you've got additional information like, let's say, their address information or comments that they want to make about themselves and so forth. And usually, sort of as a database optimization, you might actually put that in a collateral like user addendum table or something like that. So I've actually had very seldom, and actually it's in my personal usage, I have very little use for the one-to-one table. So in some sense, it's a very trivial sort of case, but it does. I can tell you, it will come up once you start building larger systems and you're trying to build out optimizations. But let's ignore that one for now. Okay. The more common thing that everybody gets hung up on, though, and the more common associations that you create are the one-to-n and the n-to-many relationships. Okay. So these are referred to usually as the has many and belongs to relationships. So the classic example, a classic example of this is a blog, okay, or let's say a news site, where you've got a user, or maybe it's, in this case, the user is taking the form of the writer of a blog, and you might have multiple users, you know, multiple authors on a blog. In fact, I'll change that right now just as an example, but I'm going to refer to user later because I did that in the examples. It might be a little bit more clear this way. So an author might have many articles, right? And an article might have an author, but it's not the case that you have two authors for one article. And this is where I think some confusion exists, because in the real world, you might actually want that, and then that's like the different sort of thing. But when you start looking at, you know, most common systems, you have, you know, some user who's authenticated and logged in, right? And then they're associated with multiple articles. Okay, so is that clear how you would have a model of many articles to a single author? Or any questions about that? And I hope it would be sort of it's equally interesting or equally grokkable that there could be some confusion when you're building out your database because you might be sort of anticipating at the beginning. It's like, well, I think there might be multiple authors or something, and then it becomes a completely different model. You'll often find that that is the problem when you're actually building out systems is you didn't anticipate that you actually did want a different type of relationship. Then you have to actually remake the models and remake the database later. But this is a very common circumstance. So here's a stronger circumstance. There's another classic example of, let's say, a customer who has many orders, right? You got to figure, that an order belongs specifically to one customer, and that there may be times also, like in Amazon, where you could have, no, I don't know if this is the case, basically, right? I mean, think about it, guys. Is there a case where you'd have a single order that goes to 2 customers? It is possible, I suppose, but not normally. And that's kind of where you want to sort of cut with the grain, basically, in your application design and your database design. Okay. Now, why this becomes important, and I did make a specific slide for this, is that the whole point of being able to do this within Ruby and Rails is that by creating these types of associations, you're able to create what they call convenience methods, ways to be able to start from a customer, let's say, and pull up all of their orders. Or, conversely, start with an order. Let's say you get an order by ID and find out what users associated with it. And also, like, all of the user details that are associated with it. So that's really important because the idea is that if I've got an order here, I don't necessarily want to put all of the details of the customer on that order. It actually may link to some other table somewhere because it's duplicate information otherwise. I have another order and I put that same information there? No. I have 2 orders, maybe even 3 orders, and they all point to a single record where the customer provides information. Okay, that's the reason why, in general, you want to have this you want to have this concept of the has many and belongs to relationship. And a lot of people really get hung up on it. And actually, has anybody sort of walked through this, the has many and belongs to, and just gotten hung up on either conceptually what it is or just sort of was not able to just sort of in general grok it, or am I sort of treading into territory that's like very familiar? Anybody?
In general, we know that there are situations where it's the hierarchy who's the relationship, and there's some situations where even after years of experience with it,
Yeah. No, I think it gets to be a treacherous territory that, in terms of just how all of the modeling gets around. And frankly, running it old school, I always have an easier time looking at an SQL diagram because its primary point is to sort of show all of these wild associations, and you can make very arbitrary associations very quickly. What Rails tends to do is that it creates pretty strong enforcement of the types of associations that you're going to put together. So if you try to pull out something very willy-nilly, it's not as forgiving as like a traditional old SQL database association. I think that's both a good and a bad design constraint, actually, because Rails' opinion, in my opinion, is generally things should not get that complicated. You generally are working with like in Rails models, I generally have been seeing like, yeah, you get maybe 7 models or something like that. You start topping. I know that it gets larger than that, but it's like I start looking at the larger systems. It's just like I'm not sure it needs to be that big. Like Rails tries to run things pretty more succinctly, basically, and that's because of other stuff that's not going to be handled in this course. Okay, there are some shortcuts and these types of things that go on. Okay, so the other type of relationship that people most commonly run into is the end-to-end relationship, many-to-many. And this, confusingly, is referred to as has and belongs to many, which sounds very similar when you sort of just like speak it very quickly to has many and belongs to. Okay, But has and belongs to many actually is such a strong concept that you usually see this acronym associated with it. In fact, if you Google it up, you will find immediately it just pulls up like it's in Rails. Basically, it's referred to as this. Basically, the has and belongs to many relationship. Okay, so you'll see this oftentimes in like Stack Overflow and so forth. And if you're Googling, if you're having trouble with this particular type of association, just remember that not only is it called has and belongs to many, but it's also referred to by this HABTM acronym. Okay, that's a little street knowledge there. And this is a many-to-many relation. This is also referred to as a as a many-to-many relationship. The other relationship is also referred to as a many-to-one or one-to-many. And the many-to-many relationship gets a little trickier because you actually have to do stuff that doesn't have like obvious generators in order to create. You actually have to create an additional table manually. So that tends to trip up some people when you're trying to create this stuff. But a typical example of this would be something like categories within a blog, less so articles. Okay, so like tags on something. So many users could have many categories. And those categories then, if you look them up, could have many users. So for example, you might have Harold, Kumar, Fred, and Carrie, okay? And they all are associated with the category news and weather on a news site. If you looked up news as a tag, you would find that they're associated with those 4 users I named, and weather, the same deal, basically. So you have a multiple-to-multiple relationship, so it starts getting dicey. And again, those are across different tables. I'm going to actually jump forward to another common type of relationship, which I'm not going to cover tonight, but you guys should be aware of, which is sort of a follower and followed by relationship. This is kind of the Twitter model, basically, where you can follow somebody, and then they might follow you back. And actually, that's running all off a single model and a single table. So it's a kind of a weird thing that way, because it's actually, you've got pointers that are going into the table, and then pointers in that table going back to itself. All of the other associations that I'm dealing with tonight are between 2 different tables. So conceptually, it's actually easier that way. But in covering this, which I still don't quite like fully get, okay, it's a difficult sort of concept because there's all this sort of like, or excuse me, it's difficult execution. It's not that difficult to think about because it's exactly what's going on in Twitter. That would require its own 2 hours because people you could see it on tutorials. People get tripped on it all the time. It's a toughie. Okay.
That's a single table inheritance.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Oh, actually, no. It's not quite the same as single table inheritance. You're inside of you've got records in the table referring to the same table. Records in the same table. Yeah. So it's not quite the same as a single table inheritance model. It's record because there's no concept of heredity. I think that's going on there. In any case, I'll try to cover it a little bit better after the fact. Okay. And then just to finish it off, also stuff that you should know about, but I'm not going to quite cover, is has many through, which is actually like a 3-table association. Okay. It is similar to this HABTM that I was talking about, but it actually assumes that you've got additional data that's in the middle table, and that you might be doing something like get me, I'm user Fred, get me all articles that are news, like in Nature. So what happens is you go through the categories table and then end up on an articles table. Okay. So the main point of this is not to you guys will not memorize all this stuff right away. My suggestion is just concentrate and really get has many belongs to, and then has and belongs to many, which is what we're going to cover in depth tonight. And out of this, you can do a lot of system design before you have to get to other stuff. Okay. So here, let me move forward with this. Okay, so oops. Sorry, I have a slide out of space here. Okay. Okay, see ya. Covering has many and belongs to. Okay, so actually, I'm going to skip ahead in a slide here. So I've already described that you have two tables. One is going to be a table that has many, and another is a table that belongs to. Okay. Conceptually, God, I really got this out of its place here. I don't know why. I'm really sorry, gang. I had a conceptual slide here that showed what was going on here, but this may explain it just as well. Let's pretend that this is. Can you see this okay, by the way? Yeah. Let's pretend that this is the user model here, right, for users. And let's pretend that this is populated with, that the user model has a single property, which is name. And that I've populated with 4 records here. And that each of the records gets its auto-numbered ID value that's associated with it. Okay. Let's pretend that we've also built another table or another model called article, and that this article model has a few more properties, a few more fields. Title is one, body is another, and there's an additional. It also gets its own ID numbers for each unique record in the table. Okay. But it actually gets an additional column, which is the basis for the association between these two tables. So let me repeat that. The additional column is the basis for association between the two tables. And the idea of it is that if you were doing this naively and just creating an article model that was not intended to be associated with anything, you would leave out this column user ID. But since you know that you're going to associate these two things together, you will actually, within Rails model, when you do your models generation, you'll actually add in an additional column called user ID, which has an integer value. And those integer values are going to be populated with the associated ID in the user field. So visually, if you take this, and I just drew, I drew my my diagram sort of backwards here. So what I did was I took these user IDs and I just placed them in the front here. Okay. So you guys know from Rails models, I hope, that you can just call up that particular user ID, you know, arbitrarily if you want to. And what you're going to see is a one on this side, a one-to-many association of, excuse me, on this side you'll see a one-to-many association of IDs to numbers. So what conceptually is going on here is, if you can see the first column there, Harold has a article which is called, whose title is NPM Stole My Bike, okay, or Stole My Car. Kumar, if you look him up, has no articles associated with them because there are no IDs that say 2. If you look at 3, and if you were to do a lookup on 3, you can see 3 appears twice in this article table, and so there are 2 articles associated with the user Fred. And then even though it's out of order there, you can see that Carrie, who's user 4, their association with the ID number over there is gives her 1 article. So you'll notice that this user column corresponds to the IDs in this user ID. It does not correspond to these numbers here, which are arbitrary and can essentially be forgotten from an association standpoint. Okay, that's probably not extremely clear, but as I walk through an example of this in coding it, I hope I can make it clear. Okay, so let's actually build this out so that we can see how that association is working. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new application. It doesn't matter what it's called. So like, let's call it model app. Okay, and I've got it set so it doesn't auto-create. So I've got to create my database. Oh, that's interesting. Why the heck did it not find? What? Oh, whoops, because I didn't go into the app. How about I didn't go into the app? What did I just call it here? Model app. CD model app. Rake DB create. Sorry about that. Okay. And I'm going to open up Sublime here so that we can see our, that's our previous stuff here. Let's open up our. Okay, so I hope this is somewhat familiar territory here. That I've got Rails up. Okay, it's a standard app, right? Let's open up things that are going to be relevant to us. So I'm going to open up the app directory, and then I'm going to open up models here. Okay, so no models have been created at this point. I'm going to open up DB. No migrations have been created at this point either. Anybody lost at this point? I mean, you guys have at least done some Rails, right? Little basic, right? Okay. And I'm going to do what it says in my notes here, which is I'm going to create a user model here. Turn on that guy. Okay, so what did that do? It just created a model with a very simple model user with the name field associated with it, right? Fairly simple, right? I'm going to create this other thing. Which is generating a model article. But you'll notice that not only did I give it name string, but I also gave it a user underscore ID of integer. So that corresponds to this thing that we saw earlier, right? Okay. So we're going to build out the rest of this now. I'm going to when I go into when I look at models now, we see that these were actually generated with the generator, right? And you can see that they're fairly empty except for the inheritance from active record, right? So you have to tell Rails, I'm going, whoops, wrong file. You have to tell Rails, okay, User is going to have many articles. Article is going to belong to user. Save both of those guys. And I believe that is it. At that point, what I do is I run my migration, rake dd migrate. And theoretically, this association is ready to be put into play. So the way that I check that is by going into Rails console. You can do with the abbreviation RailsC. And now I can start playing with it. Is everybody familiar with Rails console, I hope? So pretty basic in terms of like just sort of learning, because you want to fiddle, generally you want to fiddle around with whatever's in Rails console or IRB, but specifically Rails console because it brings up the same environment that you're in within Rails in order to figure out how code snippets work, and then you grab the code and then you put it into your own code, okay, into your actual application. So let's take a look at user to see if user, user did not get created. Why did I do, user all. Okay, so that actually is working. There's the reason why it gave me an error there is that user is, I believe, is not, is just simply not populated. If I do a user all, it shows me that I do have an active record relationship there and that it exists. It didn't just bomb out like if I typed in boom.all, which is some method, or excuse me, some table that doesn't exist. That simply doesn't exist. But the table, I know that the model user exists now. I also know that the model article should exist now. And it does. Okay. So now, if I do, if I start to populate the user with by adding in, but let's populate user by adding in a single record, a very simple single record. So I'm going to say user.create name Fred. Okay. So that puts a single record with user ID 1, you can see, with into the user table, and the name Fred happens to be the only property of that particular record at this point. Okay, so now if I do something like user.all, I see that I've got population inside that table. If I do something like user first, I should be able to get that same record back. So far, not too interesting, right? But if I do user.u equals user.first, so that I can just refer to it quickly as u, when I hit u, I still get that same record back. Nothing mysterious at this point. Okay. Let's do the same thing with article. So article.all, there's nothing in there. Article.create, and I think I used name. I should have used title, but let's say name. Put a bird on it is the name of our title, let's say, or excuse me, name of our article. Let's pretend. Okay, so now if I do article.first, I see that I've got that one record in the table at this point, right? If I'm starting from, if I show you and I'm starting from you and I say, please show me any articles that are associated with you, something interesting happens. It gives me no results, but it doesn't error out exactly. It tells me that there's an association that's going on there. So that's actually fairly interesting. If I would typed in something else like, remember I typed in boom earlier, it's like, how many booms do I have? It's going to give me an error. But already we know that Rails has associated something here. Okay, so now that I've got some, something that I can refer to in U, and now that I've got something inside of articles, let's do something more with that. Let's actually create an association by shoveling the first article into user articles. Okay, so now something interesting happens. If I type in u.articles, it actually has the thing that I've associated at this point. If I type in let's see, actually, let's do something else here, which is sort of interesting. If I type in A is equal to article first, remember I typed in first earlier here in order to shovel that into U. If I type A user, it gives me Fred back. So these associations start becoming useful. If I type in a.user.name, it gives me just Fred back. So you can kind of see how if you had a just a variable that was, or excuse me, just an object U that was created based on the class user, you're not able to get anything within articles naively, just at first glance. But since we created this association and did that shovel operation that we did, right, in order to push something into that object, now all of a sudden we're able to cast back and forth between these two things. And you might anticipate, now I can use that code in order to be able to bring up articles that are associated with users and users that are associated with articles. Let's do another one. So I'm going to let's add another article, right? So article dot, let's create another one, right? Name, and let's call it second article. Okay. At this point, you can refer to, I hope you guys know this much from the simple models, you can refer to the last article in a model listing or in a model. It's hard to sort of, I never sort of wrap my head around it. I always refer to it as a table, going old school. But if I type in article last, it gives me second article, and article first is still there. Article 1, right? Now, let's say we wanted to add that to Fred. Or excuse me, our U object, which happens to hold Fred at this point. I do that, and now if I type in U articles, you'll see that two things come up. Bird on it, and second article. What's interesting is that you can start extracting individual fields also in the same manner. So you can actually do things like this. And this syntax always defied me. This always is kind of weird to me. Pluck name. Pulls out just the name portion of the associated articles. Okay. So let's see, and again, the obverse is true if we do article.last user. What do we get back? That same user Fred. Okay. So are there any questions at this point? I know I went sort of fast with that, but I'm sorry, I wanted to sort of show you, like, this is how you create the thing, this is how you put some data into it, and this is kind of how you move stuff sort of back and forth inside of Rails.
Are there any commands that can show you, like, what relationship the table has or one model has with another? So instead of having to like look through that model, looking for that has many statement or belongs to, is there anything like here?
You know what? That came up and in a project that I did, and I actually had to go to a third-party gem called Railroady, I think, because the original Railroad was not being supported So railroadee, and that's a great question, by the way. Here, let's look this up. Railroadee. Let's see if I can show the output from railroadee. Do they have an example of a diagram? Gem. I bet you if I just looked under images, it would show something. Yeah. See this type of thing? So if you created like this huge nested model set, or even a simple one, and it did a gem install, and then you did a railroadee dump, which I won't do because it's a little bit of a setup in order to do right now, you're able to pull this data back. There's another gem, Ken, I don't know if you know of it, Brad uses it all the time, that will also describe the tables. I'll have to look it up and then put it in the whiteboard notes afterwards. But that's one of the, to me, again, I don't want to speak so badly for Rails, but it's like my third language, I think, rather than, it's like a more front-endy. The confounding things in working with Rails, because in SQL, it's like you sometimes like start with something like this, and then they've got like visual generators that will create, that stuff. And weirdly in Rails, it's been kind of absent because there's so many other weird things that you could do with objects that I don't think anybody has gone extremely far down that path. But I do actually recommend because, and I can tell you from project experience, when somebody was asking for a dump, this is what we turn to. So it actually may be useful for you in setting it up if you were trying to understand conceptually where how your models are going. But most of the time, when you're about 2 or 3 tables, you're generally holding it in your head or on a scratch piece of paper or something like that. Any other questions about this? So again, I know that was a bit to go through. How do you get rid of an association? Might be a question that you have. So we had U, and U.articles. We had A, which referred to the first one, right? Excuse me, referred to put a bird on it, right? If I do U.articles. I believe it's delete A, and then looked at U.articles again, see that, oops, the article has not been deleted. Oh no, it did get deleted. I'm sorry, that's my vision, not my code. It did get deleted. Okay, so some things to look at when you are walking through this thing is, and doing it on your own, is just remember that this is the operator that actually starts putting the associations into the is that the has many or belongs to portion of the relationship? The has many portions of the relationship. The user has many articles. Okay. And why I point that out is that it's a detail in Rails tutorials that seems to get skipped over. I have to, like, I'll be reading along, doing code, and it's like, how is it that I got those things inside the association in the first place when I couldn't find them? And it's that operator. And if you try to Google it, it's a little bit difficult to do because it's a symbol. It's a shovel operator. Okay. I don't think it's even formally a shovel operator. I think it's like the array push operator or something like that. Yeah, it's an array push operator. Yeah.
You can build the association in one step. Maybe you can show that.
Oh yeah, let's see. There's U.articles. Is it this? I think it is. It's article. Help me with this. It's article create, like article create.
No shovel operator. So U.articles dot create.
Oh yeah, right.
And then
like.
And then your
Well, there's a common like create, like there's like the build operator, there's the build method, right? You might want to look that up for me just now because I'm not more commonly doing that, although you may run into that as you're building it out with controllers, right? But you could do, here, I'm going to do this other one while you're doing that. Please look that up. I appreciate that. U.articles, do this in one step. Article dot create, and then whatever parameters you had, you know, a third article, like that as well. And then when you do u.articles, there should be, yeah, two things there because I deleted the first one. So you can do that as well. Did you find it yet? Not quite?
Yeah, so if you did, try to user,
Yeah.
or articles,
Yeah.
build,
Dot build, yeah.
and then in parentheses you could do the title.
All right, okay, so like name, fourth article, or whatever parameters you had for articles.
Try that.
Let's try that. And that may have worked actually, let's see. And let's actually do usave on that. U.articles. Yep, that worked.
And it built the association.
And it built the association. So it built it and it built the association. Notice that there are that we did the save there. Okay, gang. And this is something that you just have to learn within Rails. It's like there's certain operations that for which the record is not saved to the database unless you do a save on the object. Build is one. New, I think, is another. Like, so if I created, if I wanted to do like user new name Kerry. Oops, no, that's not it. U.new. Wait a second. What am I doing here? Sorry. U equal user.new name.Kerry. So now actually I've blown out my previous U there, so I no longer have U as Fred, but I should have U as Kerry. But if I looked inside of the database at that point by doing user all, you'll see that Fred is the only thing that's in that database. So to make sure that whatever I was building or creating new on U, I actually have to do a U save on that guy. And then when I look at user all, you can see that I have both Fred and Kerry inside the database, inside storage at this point. Okay. Hopefully you knew that from before, but in case you didn't, there's a bunch of those types of operations basically that you have to know about, and that's one of the most well-known ones is new versus create, and another is build, as was pointed out by. I'm sorry, what was your name? Sorry, Anthony. That Anthony pointed out. Okay. So again, I don't expect, if this is completely new to you, I don't expect you to absorb this all at once. This is sort of like knowledge to start with. I found a really good resource, which I pulled and stole liberally from, is simply the A-Press's Beginning Rails 4, which actually has one of the better explanations of this stuff that I've seen. Okay. Michael Hartle's stuff actually online is getting pretty good, but I still feel is fairly well congested because he tries to make you into a full stack developer before explaining how Rails, while he's explaining how Rails works with you. Okay. Oh, it's right. IT. Yeah. You could probably get this online from a number of sources. Okay. Okay, so any questions right now before I press on to many-to-many? And again, I'll put these slides up. I'll try to put some GitHub examples up also, or just examples so that you can just sort of build and toy around with it. But But I would encourage you to just build out extremely simple models and then do what I did basically, which is just toy around with them to see how those associations work. Okay. So let's move on to has many and belongs to. Okay, so in has many and belongs to, oh, that's where my previous slide was. I'm sorry. That should have been up, blah, 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 a little bit earlier up here. Sorry, I'm having trouble navigating here. Okay, well, we've already done has many and belongs to, so we're going to move on to, for God's sakes, has and belongs to many. The many-to-many relationships. I find it's just easier to just call it which one are we doing? I'm doing many-to-many, and then either googling it or looking backwards or just remembering it's like, oh yeah, that's that had-to relationship that we're doing. So the way that this works is, to remind you, it's a common case would be users associating with categories. So if you looked at a user, you could find all the categories associated, or if you're looking at any single category, you could find all the users that are associated with it. Okay, so it's many in this way. It will look kind of like this. So we're going to build up two tables. One is user, which we had before, almost exactly. In fact, I'm going to use the same user table. And then you have this thing category. And the thing is that we're going to be creating a joining table in between. That actually, so what happens is the relationship between the categories does not go directly to the user table. Categories goes to this table instead. The user goes to this table instead. So you can start filling out number versus number, basically, in this way. Let's pretend we have our users, Harold Huber, Fred, and Jerry. Let's pretend that we have our categories, news, weather, sports, and features. And you have a table that kind of looks like this. Okay? And you can see there are multiple users, there are multiple duplicates. This is not primary key, meaning there's no uniqueness on the user IDs. You've got like lots of them here, and you've also got lots of categories here. There's no restriction on the uniqueness of these tables, and so when you set up these numbers, you probably sort of understand if user is 2 and category is 3, when I pull this record out, what's that association? Well, user 2 is Kumar, category 3 is sports. So what this is saying, the meaning of this in the database is Kumar is associated with sports, and so on for the entire table. Okay, so that's why you have this joining table. So what's funky about this in Rails, and I don't know why this isn't the case and why this hasn't hit core Rails, is why isn't there just a generator for like Rails generate model habitant, and then being able to add in a whole bunch of stuff so it automatically generates this stuff? I'm actually kind of not sure that that's the case because it's a little bit of manual work to be able to do this. So I'm going to walk through that, and then we're going to do the same gameplay of typing this stuff in. Okay. So once again, user has and belongs to many categories. Category has and belongs to many users. So let's create that joining table that we were talking about, that thing in the middle that actually creates the associations. So assuming that, actually, I don't have a categories table yet, so that first thing I'm going to do is do that. So let's quit out of this first. And what I'm going to do is Rails generate model category. It's singular. This just drives me nuts also, and something that you should be cognizant of. It's just when to capitalize and when to make it singular. So at the time that you're doing model generation, it is capped and singular. Okay? But then I'll show you in other contexts that same category is going to be plural and lowercase, and it's there'll be different meaning for it. Okay? So let's do let's give it the same name, string, and this time I am not going to give it like user ID. Okay? Because when you create the model, for this, it automatically creates its own primary key. So I know that each individual item within category is going to be unique, but I don't have to actually do association within the category model itself. Okay, so bear with me on that. I think it'll become a little bit more clear as I build this thing out. Okay, so now I've got a table category. It's not associated with anything right now. I haven't done any of the association that goes on. So if I actually went into Rails console, and sorry, actually, let me quit out of this first. I'd have to migrate this first to say that this is. Well, let me not do that first. Actually, let me go ahead and just build out this thing normally, because I'm not sure what's going to happen if I try to build it out and it'll blow it out. We need to create an additional join table. So in Rails 4, the way that this is done is by typing in something like this. Rails generate migration, and it's a different migration, which is creating, which takes this form. Let me type in here. Create underscore lowercase plural first table name, lowercase plural second table name. And guess what? These have to be in alphabetical order. Funky, right? I mean, to me, I think that's kind of crazy, but I've run some stuff before. It's just like, why isn't it working? It's like spent hours on this basically because I did create users categories, and you look up Stack Overlap, it's like must be in alphabetical order. So big freaking caveat there. Save you some few hours there, basically. So in general, be on the lookout for that stuff in Rails because it will trip you up so many times when you're trying to learn this stuff. Okay. So I'm going to hit the magic button here. Oh, and also a few other notes here that they have to be in alphabetical order. They should have underscore between the words, which is weird because once it creates the migration, inside the migration, you'll see that the underscores are removed and it's moved to camel case. Again, I don't know. I believe actually you can probably get away with camel case here.
Yeah, you can do like tabs.
Yeah, that you could do that as well. Also, yeah. So maybe this is not. I think it's a should have, so that instead of a must, you could probably camel case that guy. But look it up to be sure. Okay. And then, but even if it is camel case, I believe it must be plural. Okay. Hit the button on that guy. Okay, so it creates a migration, right? And I want to show you the migration bearer before we F around with it. So db migrate, and you can see that there's a create category users migration here now. I go inside here, and we see, again, it might be my own annoyance, but it is, it's created, it's put it into camel case at that point, right? But it's fairly bare at this point. It's like create a new table called categories underscore users. So what needs to be done with this, interestingly, and this is where actually the reason why you need to know SQL, or not need to know SQL, but having a little SQL knowledge informs the step that I'm going to show you next. If you don't want to learn SQL, just take this for granted that you need to do this, okay? The step is removing a primary key on this table. So this is exactly what it generated, but you need to change it into something that looks like this. And this part is important to add in this comma ID false. Okay, whoops, I added 2 commas there because I typed in my own. And then after that, oops, sorry about that. Typing this in. T references category, T references user. And so you probably have in your memory the table that we just saw. that's creating those two columns there, or excuse me, saying that those associate in that sort of way. It's actually creating or excuse me, it's actually naming the table columns at that point. And as it turns out, this is not an absolute ad minimum, but is a good to have. Is you might drop this at some point. So commonly, you would add something like this. So you can run a rake drop or drake, or what is it? I forget what the command is. When you drop the table, it will drop this as well. When you do a rake drop or something like that. In any case, if you look at almost any reference book on this or online tutorials, all that sort of stuff, this is kind of like the at minimum to be able to do this. There's some additional stuff that could put in here for those for experts, like foreign key relation. You can actually enforce foreign key within SQL, but let's not talk about that right now. We're just concentrating on what the properties of this many-to-many relationship are. Okay. So now I have actually created a migration or edited the migration so that when I run dbmigrate, it will create that additional table. But we're not quite done yet. We actually have to go into the models themselves that we're playing with, user and category, and say that the has and belongs to many relationship is going to exist. So the way that's done is going into category and doing that. It has and belongs to many users. Same deal with, oops, that should be user, sorry. So inside of user, has and belongs to many categories. Okay, so you can see the symmetry there, right? You can also see that I don't have to remove the has many from user, that you can have as many of these things as you want to. And I believe at this point we are set up to run a migration to get a has and belongs to many relationships. Let's do that. Migrate, db migrate. Okay, so this is sort of interesting where you can see create a table for category, like didn't have that before, and then it created this new table category users, and it employed that additional little bit of information, which is ID equals false. So the idea here, and I'm going to talk a little gobbledygook here, so maybe it'll make some sense here. Generally, you have something called a primary key in a model, which basically is enforcement from the database standpoint, saying that each record has a unique number associated with it, okay, and that number can only be used once. Since we're doing a has and belongs to many model, you can see that in like a table like this, numbers are duplicated on both columns. So you have to remove the restriction that there's only one, there's only one 2, there's only one 3. No, I can have as many 1s as I want to. I can have as many 2s as I want to, and I can have as many 1s and 2s as I want to on either of those columns. Okay, so that's kind of what that's doing. That's old school SQL. Okay, but it's also the way that those relate. Okay, and that's how Rails sort of automatically, once you've got that set up and you're telling it, oh yeah, do that, then you don't have to do all the sticky details that you used to have to do with an SQL. Now you can actually do the type of magic that I'm about to show you here, which is similar to the has many and belongs to relationships here. Okay, so I think we're ready to just toy with this now. Once again, Rails console fires up. Let's take a look at users. We've got some users already. We've got a user already in there. 2 users actually, Fred and Carrie. Let's look at category. Nothing inside of categories at this point. Let's. I'm not going to create all these names here. Let's just add in a few categories here, like category create name news. Let's pretend like it's a kind of a blog site here, and sports and weather. Now, if I take a look at category singular, all, I can see I've got 3 records. You can see that they've all ID'd differently here. If I do something like, let's say, let's go back to our, let's see if view exists, which it doesn't because I just refired up Rails console, excuse me. Let's make user equal to user first. View equal to user first. Okay, so I'm grabbing Fred out of the database, out of the class here. Okay, and let's take a look at U categories to see if it freaks out or not. Okay, it didn't freak out. I mean, it's telling us some stuff, but it didn't like completely blow up here. That association is working. If I type in U dot, let's say, remember we had some, we were looking at like booms before, as if booms were an association. It does blow up. So there's nothing associated with booms, but there is something associated with categories. But there just don't happen to be anything. There is. It just so happens that nothing is inside there right now. So let's do something like this. C is equal to the first category. Category dot first. And then let's once again do U dot categories. Shovel C. Okay, so now when I take a look at U categories, I've got news, so it's kind of similar. If I do C.users, and notice it's not singular, it's plural at this point, I get I get Fred. So again, it's going backwards and forwards, you know, in this way. So I started adding stuff, and I believe I can just sort of shovel in the same sort of way. Let's see if that's the case, and I'm not telling a fib here. C.users user.last. Okay, so I'm able to do something here that I'm not able to do in the other one, which is actually just push a user into categories rather than simply putting categories into users. These things work both ways at this point. So now if I took a look at C.users, I can see that there's this association with both the users there. And theoretically, if I were to look at the last user and look at their categories, should be something there. And there is. There's news. Okay. So we can sit here and toy with it and just add additional elements, but you can start seeing how you can start adding as many categories as you wanted to, either directly through the console or through population within your application or through a form of some sort. And in the same way, you could add categories to users. You can actually add users to categories, and then actually read out and produce extractions from those, so that you might have a web view, for example, right, that says, well, show me all the users that are subscribed to news. Well, what's that going to be? In this case, would be C.users, right? Give me all the names of those guys in a list. C.users pluck name. Whoops, that didn't work. Because I put a comma there, maybe. There we go. Fred and Carrie. Give me all of the categories that are, give me all the category names that are associated with the user at user object U. Categories pluck name. New, just news. Okay. So either somewhat familiar territory to you, or in which case I was trying to sort of reiterate some points and look at some sore spots. Things like capitalization and order rules that you have when you're creating these things. Running through a few of these conceptual examples. And again, if this is new to you, I really, there's a reason why I wanted to do this course is actually because I have a lot of trouble with the ways that Rails was handling this. This is actually somewhat easy stuff to do in SQL. It's stuff that you almost trivially learn over a weekend. And I struggled for like weeks on this stuff because there were so many like weird sort of details with learning it in the Rails manner. The good thing, I'm glad that Ken's nodding, is just like, wait, hey man, old school, it's like there used to be an easier way to be able to do this. What happened to that? Because I used to build apps like that, and now it's taking me a long time to do. But then Brad, who's a few years younger, like a decade younger than I am, is just like, oh yeah, that's the way that you create these associations, right? So depends on where your learning standpoint is. Everybody learns a little bit differently. So I'm trying to sort of address it in a couple of different ways here, okay? But I hope this gives you at least a few hints as to, once I had this down, then I started getting sold on, like, that's actually a pretty good way to be able to do things because the syntax for being able to pull this stuff out is so much easier than in the old SQL way. And granted, it's because I know SQL, and Ken probably knows this stuff too. You'd be doing things like select name from table name, like article where articles dot name equals user dot name is the same as u dot articles. Okay. That's the savings that you get for Rails, basically, is to be able to, u dot articles dot pluck dot name gives that exact same result. Okay. So that's a more readable syntax to be able to have, basically. So that's the reason why, if you're struggling, like I did, why you want to go through the trouble of actually sort of learning this and then playing by these very sort of constricted rules in order to do this. If you are new to this and are just learning it naturally, then I hope it gives you sort of like a conceptual understanding of the history that went on before this. Because I can answer a lot of detailed questions about how this works underneath. But strangely, I had a very difficult time in sort of just producing. It's like, here's the basic syntax that's going on here. Okay. So that's the end of this presentation at this time. Are there questions?
Is there a new way to learn some of those methods, like without having to read the whole
API? Yeah, good question. Rails is, from a community standpoint, is really, sort of likes you to have to go through a number of hoops, I think. And like things like Pluck, I mean, it's like I only learned that like very late, by doing a lot of tutorials and then just picking it up and then just like writing it down, And Pluck came like later also. It was like a later add-on, basically. It's just like, I want to just have some way to be able to pull out in an array, these couple of, and there are probably several other ways to be able to pull out just that name, that name portion as well, right? And what I've been dodging away from also is things like all of the find and find by also is the typical way that you'd also extract information out of the, like a particular row out of the database, Those types of things also, one, you have, going through a tutorial, that focuses on just Rails learning is what I sort of suggest. But you have to learn some practice because I got tripped up on like user.findByName is not the same as user.where colon name colon, excuse me, user where name and then fill out name. It actually produces a different object type that's returned. Like one returns an array which you cannot operate on, and the other one returns an object that actually has methods that you could do further chainable operations on. Where do you learn that? To my thinking, it's difficult to learn unless you toy around with it a lot. So what I've taken to is actually just toying around a lot in Rails Council, and then picking up notes, and I put it in Evernote or in my OneNote to these little tricks that I sort of find. But unfortunately, there may be some tip sheets, that are out there. But I've never quite seen. Maybe I should try to start putting one together. It's like things that Rails learners commonly sort of run into that end up being sort of helpers to learn it. So Pluck was a major one for me because it's like oftentimes I would just like want to pull out that one column to pull it out. And I remember when they introduced that. I think it's actually a Ruby, not a Rails. Yeah, it's a Ruby keyword. Yeah, where it's like, oh my God, thank you so much. It's like, it's fine. Finally, there's an ability to be able to just sort of like, pull down on that and just immediately start using it. I'm sure there's a better way to use it, or there's a better method, to be able to use. I'm trying to think of like what other things like the pretzel colon, for example, which is just like, even to my girlfriend who was programming in Rails, I was mentioning this to her the other day. It's like, look up, Google pretzel colon, and it's like a substitute for proc, and allows you to do, it's a shortcut for like a mapping type operation, and like that I use a lot basically also, it's just like, so where do you learn that? It's like some of these things you just don't even find out until you have just been hanging around Rails people a bit, or just have been programming and have been digging through Stack Overflow and stuff like that. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that, because to me it actually has personally been a little confounding. I had some really old school Rails guys actually, older guys like me, that were working on a project at a media company, and we were ramping them up on iOS, of all things, Objective-C, and they surprisingly were saying it's a little easier in some sense to learn Objective-C than some of Rails, because the weird sort of twisted culture that Rails has, and where all the information is like, everything's like documented in and supported in Objective-C. It's just like, I've never heard that before. Anybody saying Objective-C over Rails, that's crazy talk, But I can kind of see in having worked with Rails a little bit, I can sort of see their points. Like there's some stuff I'll look at with my partner Brad, who's not here tonight, when we're coding, paracoding. It's just like, what is that? And it's like, oh, you don't know about blah, blah, blah? It's like, whatever, plain old Ruby objects, being embedded, or service objects, it's like all these sort of conventions that kind of develop from these communities. Is a little bit, you have to do a lot of it. You have to do a lot of it, and to go to, Stack Overflow, Railscast. Unfortunately, Railscast has stopped because he pointed out a lot of that stuff, Ryan Bates' stuff, and the Ruby 5 podcast will keep you up to date on gems and things like that. But yeah, I'll give me your name, or I'll have it on the contact list or something like that when I have it in my back of my head to sort of like get better at Rails and collecting a bunch of these things. So maybe I'll be able to collect some of these, or as I find them, I can push them, or maybe somebody else in the class, has an opinion on that. Anybody else have an opinion on that? Just general learning.
I'm sure you guys know, there's a bunch of stuff online. Sort of like, there's one big one, like it walks you through all like from the Rails backend to all the front end. It's called the Odin project. Oh yeah,
Odin project, yeah.
That's really good. It was too much, but it was really net. So, yeah.
I think I looked at the Odin project. I had a friend, I think it.
It's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah. That's what I'm about to say. It's like, part of why I'm doing this is because my complaint about Rails is effing big.
Yeah.
It is huge, and that was my first presentation. It's just like, if Rails is so easy, why am I having such difficulty learning it, right? And I actually show the graph of just like, this is like all the crap that you have to know within Rails in order to learn it. It's just like, so, and the focus of that course was learn Sinatra first, because Sinatra is actually an easier framework where you can get a lot of the foundation down, and an amazing amount of it is applicable to Rails, because it's all Ruby also, and it's also MVC. But there are a lot of conventions that are so Rails specific, like, well, you could do active record inside of Sinatra, but in practice nobody does. They use Data Mapper instead. But learning all of those types of things is just like doing it a bunch of times, and then waiting for it to change also. Like all of validations or not validations. What do you call it? Sanitizing in a parameter input changed in the most recent Rails, right? So it's like you'll learn it one way and then you have to relearn it, another time basically. So it's like Rails is a fair investment basically of time to be able to get invested with. So I just say keep building on it, I mean, it would be sort of interesting. It's like, what's your goal basically? Are you trying to get to a developer point or web dev
like
point?
You said, web dev, but wow, that's just new to me. It's the plug. Like, how have I not seen that before?
Yeah, it's new. It's just
new.
Yeah, because before that, it's kind of the same thing as a map method, which is kind of pretty much making an array. Like, okay, you iterate your array, and okay, let me just get this. So that's just like, just a new method from Ruby. I think it was just 2.
Yeah, it was late. It was way late. Yeah. For Ruby, it's like Ruby. Yeah. It was like Ruby 2.0 or something like that. It's like when Pluck was introduced. I mean, it's totally late in the language where you're able to actually just like pull out like an array. And before that, like I'm sorry, your name is Andrew was saying, you're doing like this weird map operation. So, yeah. No, I mean, I've worked on a number of frameworks. Like I do Angular. Angular is actually my favorite, and doing just JavaScript front end is actually my favorite thing to do right now. And being able to do Node, it's like all of these things tend to be a lot easier to do than the entirety of Rails. At the same time, you guys are younger than I am, and like Brad just like sucked up, like all of this, and it's like these guys will just suck up all of the knowledge on Rails. So, but I feel it's like there's a lot of time that you have to spend with Rails. So what I try to do is just like get you to understand conceptually a lot of these things, and then in practice, then you start filling out some of the details. But unfortunately, it's like plugins. It's just like you wait for that sort of stuff. For me, it was just like I remembered that specific command out of all of the zillions of commands because it's just like that completely solves that whole like weird map syntax that existed before. So yeah, so I don't know what else to tell you, Lawrence, right? Yeah, okay, yeah. But let's see if I even have that sort of slide about like what was it? Rails school. Fire. Rails model example. I may not have it actually right now. Yeah, the I had a. I cannot find it right now, but anyway, I wanted to show you the graphically how large Rails is. It's like there's a ton of stuff to learn because it starts out with this abstraction of the database to begin with. Right? I mean, let me ask this actually: how many are old school and no SQL? Oh, okay, so this is actually pretty good actually that you've got the SQL knowledge here basically. Okay, so that actually gets past a lot, but you don't do things in the old SQL sort of way. I kept like wanting to go back into that zone of like SQL, and it's just like no, that's not the Ruby, like that's not the Rails way. The Rails way is you've got the ORM, right, and you're ultimately trying to build towards these very short methods that you're sort of collecting for yourself that do the type of things that you need to do in your controller and your models, right? So that's the sort of iterative sort of thing that you want to do with Rails basically is like create a model, create some logic behind it, build up what you think the associations are, see that the associations kind of work out, and then start looking at like, oh yeah, okay, now I know that if I do U equals blah blah blah, right, it's going to give me that weird association because usually all you're doing is like sticking it in some controller in view somewhere, usually like a controller action of some sort, right? Or excuse me, it's abstract. It will funnel up to the view basically. There's a parameter that's passed in, and then you're just calling it based on some parameter value. It's like that's kind of most of Rails, is that it's like it's in a weird sense just plumbing. Is the way my girlfriend who used to do a lot of Rails programming. But it's like a lot of weird plumbing. But it's like you have to know SQL, you have to know Ruby Neat, you have to know like whatever the latest version of Rails is, you have to know this MVC architecture, you have to know for full web dev, you have to know Git, you have to know Rake, right, is its own sort of realm. We have, testing is its own sort of realm, and to be BDD and TDD is really kind of the way to go with web dev. That's what makes Michael Hartle's popular online course good, I think, but at the same time it serves as an impediment because it's a struggle just to get your head wrapped around this stuff, in my opinion. I haven't even shown you, there's still all the other weird stuff that you want to be able to do with it, the followers and all the inverse sort of stuff, So you have to run through all of that, right? You have all the weird stuff that can happen with controllers, but then you have to sort of evaluate, well, what do you get free with that once you've set that up? It's like, well, the convention over configuration is really good. So it's like whenever you build something, you know where stuff is going to go within Rails, so you get that back, right? You're generally building the same thing over and over and over again. So once you build one, here's my belief: it's like once you build one master project and really understand how user and particularly things like OAuth or authentication work, and both authentication and authorization with something like Devise or something like that, you basically are just going to steal from that same master project over and over and over again. So, I've been talking about this with the other Rails teachers also. It's just like we need to build up the curriculum so that you're just building up that one master project, because once you've done that, you're just stealing from that over and over again. Everything else is actually a fairly small variation unless you're building out your own gems and that type of thing. So, but it does take a while. I mean, it's like I admit it. I've been struggling with this in part by being on and off for probably 2 years, on this. That's really long for me because I learned SQL in 2 or 3 weeks, PHP in about 3 to 4 weeks based on Perl background. And then I had back in the day, we had a minimal viable product that we brought to market within about 2.5 months. Started from zero, right? And it's like Rails takes 2 years in order to, and again, different experience from, some of the young guys basically who would just suck it down. So if you're having trouble now, put your nose, in my opinion, put your nose to the grindstone. Keep coming to Rails classes, figure out the stuff that you don't know, maybe volunteer like I am. This is actually my own way of trying to get past my own impediments, because I don't know, I'm a learner of this stuff, so it's like if I can articulate it to you, then I'm not going to forget it for later, okay? And ask cohorts here. I'm here to make some friends here, basically, to be able to say, well, how are you solving these problems as well? But I can tell you from a framework standpoint, if you want to do web dev, it's almost easier to do MVC platforms right now that are front-end based with service-based backends like Firebase, or the Node stack with JavaScript on top is pretty fast to learn, because the learning time, in my opinion, is on the order of learning like Sinatra. And that's another way to actually get past a lot of stuff. Is like Sinatra, I feel, can be learned in about a weekend or 2. And that gives you a faster track. It wasn't until I did Sinatra that I actually returned to Rails and found that it was much easier to do. And then found some resources also that concentrated only on Rails and only on Ruby. Any other questions or anything? It's interesting to me that you guys all know. Where do you guys know SQL from? You guys look young. I don't know what.
It's still very widely used.
But where? I mean, what do you couple it with? Because like Brad, for example, is just like, learn SQL. I'm not even doing that. I'm just going.
Backend, like which backend stack are you?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean.
PHP.
I typically use it with Python, right?
Or Python, yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of code to use it. With any backend architecture. I guess, are you surprised because it's like a very old technology and people it's old?
No. Why I'm surprised very specifically is because you can make the mistake that I did, which is just like you hear about Rails and go like, that's the hip thing. I'm going to start learning Rails, right? And then you start, and which is what Brad did also. It's just like he never learned SQL neat, because you can actually do almost everything.
Oh, because Rails provides
because Rails provides the abstraction, to begin with. So it totally surprises me that like every single hand in the room here, it's like, oh yeah, I know SQL. Oh, well, great. That makes all this stuff a lot easier, right? I mean, it should theoretically, right? But so the main impediment, I feel, coming from knowing SQL, is that really you want to start thinking in this object sort of way, and that your mental goal should be what are the brief set of shortcuts I'm going to create, very much the way that you would have that you would build towards like SQL prepared statements, right? When or creating a view within SQL, right? It's like you just want to have like here's my incantation that gives me all this data back in this particular way, right? So Rails is going to be the same way, except it's going to be in this even neater object model, basically, where you just have this little chaining of methods, basically, and knowing that these associations work. And then you guys know from SQL then that if you've got one to n to one, and you've got many to many, well, you've got most of SQL down, basically. It's like there's not that much more that you have to do. And that follower relationship would in SQL be like a kind of a weird thing also, where you've got a foreign key table that actually pointed to its own primary key, right? It's kind of weird, That's a denormalized structure. But I prefer talking in the realm of SQL. It's just like, is it normal or is it not? Do I have to denormalize it? It's like there's a shorter vocabulary that you have to talk to within SQL. You're thrown into the realm of Rails. You have to be in the realm of Rails. So at that point, you're method chaining. You're looking also at the states of your data, whether it's lazy loaded, whether it's been saved, into the database, or whether it was local store, or whether you want to do weird optimizations like send stuff out to Redis and then have it come back. It's like all that sort of stuff. Basically, it's a different architecture type, and it's just like, get to know other Ruby and Rails people. Basically, is what I sort of recommend, and then just do a lot of it. But yeah. Would that be useful to you guys? Do you guys sort of work from this basis? Because I used to do this in PHP a lot. It's just like once I had like user auth and user authentication down and basic modeling down, it's like, that same app I would just keep pulling out of it, and it's like you could write almost anything in it in PHP, and it's just like in Rails it seems like it's a similar type of thing where if you could just have one master Git repo that basically you could sort of like grok and understand and sort of say, well, every possibility of authorization and authentication is down, and also like an example set of all of the associations are available, then you can actually just pull from that all the time, basically. There's a lot less that you have to learn. Would that be useful? Yes? Okay. Pardon me?
I'm not at stage where that's useful.
Oh, you're not at the stage where you feel that it's, okay.
Well, no.
Yeah, no, but I'm just sort of feeling, because, I mean, you guys, the fact that you guys know SQL suggests to me that you guys are at least somewhat veteran programmers, right? Python, PHP, old school Perl, who knows, Java, right, even, right? So typically, it's just like, well, I want an archetypical thing, basically, that I just pull from all the time. And if you've like, and when Rails is big, but once you've got sort of like the baseline down, and especially with test code, harnessed into it, it's like there's not that much else that exists within Rails, basically. It's like other things start looking more interesting. You want to start doing things like WebSockets, which I know you can do within Rails, at this point, but yeah, playing around with those types of things basically starts getting to the edge of what Rails was intended for, which is basically, content delivery, fairly static content delivery also. So but yeah, granted, it is a bit big. Okay, any other questions? I hope this is all helpful in some way. Yes, no, a little bit. If nothing else, to emotionally commiserate a little bit. But also to give you some pointers. And would it be helpful to post any of this stuff or give some online pointers, or I don't know. It's like you guys already may have some resources, on this. If you guys do, you might want to write them to the whiteboard to share with the rest of the class. Because I mean, like I said, the A-Press book I thought was extremely helpful to me. Hardle seems to be cleaning its act up now. If you've gone through Hardle, at that point. Rails CAS doesn't actually cover, it's like it covers every like new thing with Rails, but it doesn't cover Rails like in particular. I wish there was something like that, for this. But yeah, so I hope it was helpful in a little bit. Okay. Well, if anybody wants to trade emails or anything like that, just because I am on sort of like the other side of my hat, basically, where I'm being an entrepreneur and just am meeting and handshaking with other people. If you guys are looking for work or trying to ramp up looking for work, basically, I would like to do, work some freelance stuff or just to sort of share to see if any opportunities are coming up. I will gladly take emails and share mine. The obverse is true also. I've got a bunch of skills, and the team that I'm working with also have a bunch of skills, and we're sort of trying to keep the ecology sort of going this way. And if you don't do it now, that's fine. We can catch up at some other point. Okay, thanks a lot, gang. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Ken, and everybody who for participating.
Wait, Dennis, you say you're going to post a link to the chat?
Yes, I will do. I will post all resources on that on Rails School.
Sorry, what's your name? I didn't catch.
Dennis. Dennis Wu. Yeah.
Your email address, since you mentioned it.
I'm sorry.
What's your email address?
Oh, DWOO at DWoo, like Dennis Wu, at sent SENT. Yep, like you sent some mail.com. Yeah.
Is it on the site?
And
Are you're on this? Yes.
yeah. Yeah. I'm also Dennis at railschool.org or whatever the heck we are.
Where are you? What's right? That's they give you money. That's good.
I'm not sure. Not certainly not. For sure. Yeah. It's 24 hours.
Well, I don't know if it's locked or open. It may or may not be because it's so
See my, I had headaches, and then I started adjusting.
I'm not exactly sure which button to press. Yeah. Okay. I like it. Thanks. Supposed to be a round button somewhere there. Using power. Race.